Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here with us. And I'd like to tell you why we wanted Trey to be here.
Yo a Trey lo conocí en su casa y hay
I met Trey at his home, and there are some things that really caught my attention about him. The first one is that he opened up the doors of his home to talk to us about the good and the bad things about his system. Secondly, in 2 generations, his father and himself, there have been changes, and they have gone from conventional tilling to intensive no-till systems, but they even went beyond no-till. It is hard for Argentinians to think about this. It is hard for us to think of planting on green crops. So if we need to plant and increase carbon sequestration, then we don't have to interrupt crop. I thought what he was doing was an interesting challenge, and this is why we wanted him to share with us his experience and the changes he has gone through. So we're very thankful to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction, probably a few more compliments than I deserve. It's really an honor to be here. I've learned a great deal just in the little time I've spent here talking to and working with the wonderful farmers here that do a truly terrific job, particularly in no-till, probably better than we do in the States. So what I wanted to talk about was just give a little background on kind of why my farm changed the way it did. It involves a lot of unique collaborations, how it's changed us in the way we've made our farm transparent, and we welcome folks into our farm to tour it, to talk about what we do, folks from outside of agriculture, and then kind of finish up with how that relates to climate change and consumerism as it relates to row crop farming, probably globally. I think that in the conversations I've had in the last day and a half, it really resonates around the world. We're all experiencing the same problems, and the farmer conversations, while in a different language, are very similar to the ones that we have at home. So I'll get started. So I like to call it ecological farming through technology. I don't like sustainable. Sustainable, if you look up the definition on Google, means able to be maintained at a certain level. And I don't think that that's what we as farmers aspire to do. We don't want to maintain at a level. We want to constantly improve. We want to raise that level. Ecological, by definition, is relating to or concerned with the relation of living organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. That to me really resonated. I work with a couple PhD ecologists on the farm, and what we're doing is looking at how different organisms relate to what we're doing and how that makes our crops grow, how we make money, how we turn profit, but also how we look at the entire farming system. We don't look at it as a spring and a fall anymore. We're looking at it all year long. So a lot of that comes from where I've lived, where I'm from. Here's my home farm. That's the Chesapeake Bay here. Whoops, I'll figure this out in a minute. That's our grain storage facility, chemical shed. I can figure this out. Chemical shed, our shop, old shop, solar panels, and some grain storage on the side. We store about 35,000 tons, which is probably not quite a full harvest for us, and then we store the rest in Argentinian bags, actually, which is kind of interesting. We borrowed that from you folks. We found that the bags are much more efficient, so that's been kind of fun for us and gotten us to get to know some folks down here. For those that don't know where I'm from, Maryland is right there. So the next picture is a little more telling. But if you look at where I live, I have Philadelphia, which is a major city, Baltimore, and Washington, all really close to me. How many folks here would want to farm around that many people in row crop farming? Show of hands. So not many, right? That's a lot of people watching us. That's a lot of involvement. We're kind of in the country. We're on this side of the Chesapeake Bay, but shoot, okay. Oh, shucks. I hit the wrong button. So we're we're over here, so it's still a country setting, but we have a lot of people involved. So that presents a lot of challenges. And we took that as, if there's going to be this many people around, we better look at it as an opportunity if I want to stay where I'm living. If I don't want to move to Argentina, if I don't want to move to Iowa, I need to welcome those people in and make it so that they can relate to the farm. So we've had people from over 40 different countries. We've partnered with a lot of different people to come to our farm. Most recently, we partnered with Bayer. We're Bayer's Forward Farm. They have one in Argentina, and they brought, I think, about 1,000 people through the farm so far, including 100 folks from our Environmental Protection Agency, congressional delegates, environmentalists, all to come on this production farm. They did a little video for us. It's kind of a nice introduction of me, and I'll play that now, hopefully. It's about 3 minutes.
Farming is truly a rewarding experience. It makes me proud of what I do. It makes me happy to raise my kids in this environment. But part of it for me has been the evolution of being able to say that I am a sustainable farmer. Our soil is in better shape than it's ever been before. What we're trying to do is look at farmland not just as a commodity, but look at it more as like a canvas on which we can create something. Trying to view it with cover crops and soil health and try to really recognize what's going on underneath the plants, whether it's reduced runoff, better nutrient retention, or even this year what we're learning about is drought tolerance. So by viewing everything as a relationship and viewing it as a holistic approach, we're able to grow high-yielding corn, high-yielding soybeans, high-yielding wheat, but also doing it in a way that cares for the ecology of the entire system that we've created. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we've taken about 4 to 4.5% of our land out of production. This has been to establish better wildlife habitat, but not just a specific kind of wildlife, but we've done quail habitat, deer habitat, duck, goose, waterfowl habitat, but also pollinator habitat. So we're starting to recognize how these different things are interrelating. A couple years ago, I was approached by Bayer to join their forward farming. It enables me to utilize all the technology and the things that we're doing for sustainability, put them together in a collaboration with Bayer and other folks that they've helped to bring in to bridge that gap with me. And what that's done is enabled me to bring people to the farm that normally never get to come to a farm. I think that today in the world there's a huge gap between those that produce food and those that consume food. One of our social responsibilities at this point is to help bridge that gap, to become more involved in the conversation as opposed to just being defensive. As a farmer, I feel like one of my most important roles is that of an environmentalist. Someone that wants to have a positive impact on the environment and is willing to advocate for that is, to me, almost the definition of a farmer. I'll be leaving the farm, the environment, and the soils in a better place than when I started. And hopefully that translates into a much better place for my children and generations to come.
So you're probably wondering how I got here. So I'll start with a little story. Started with a man named George. George helped raise me. He's worked with the family for about 40 years. So he's the one that taught me to run the planter. Was a big part in that. And everything we always did, we did about half conventional, half no-till. So we've been no-tilling for about 30 years. And we always planted it brown. We started cover cropping 20 years ago, and we would always spray the cover crops off in the early spring. We did that because we were worried what would happen if they grew tall. We were scared. We just didn't want to experience it because it was very foreign to us. And we had a really wet spring one year, and we had gone to a field to spray it off in early spring, and we'd sprayed the headlands. We put 90 feet around the field, and the rest of the field, the cover crop had grown to wheat that was about this tall. So it looked awful. It was right next to the local fertilizer dealer and also the granary where all of my neighbors go to deliver. So you can imagine that everyone was talking about me. It looked awful. We had a field that was brown around the outside, green with tall stuff in the middle. So George and I decided we needed to plant it. I was running one planter that day. George was on the other, and I said, George, why don't you go plant it? And he pulled in, and he said, Trey, it's way too tall. And I said, well, we can try it. Let's see what happens. We didn't want to spray it because if you take a tall cover crop and you kill it, it tangles up on the planter. It becomes very rubbery. It becomes a real big mess. The root balls pull over, your row cleaners, your closing wheels, everything stops up. We've been there and done that. We didn't want to work it. If we ran it through a disc and turned the soil over, We then have to wait for the root balls to die off and dry before we could plant it. So we decided to plant it. So he pulled in the field and he started planting. And he called me. George never calls me for anything that's going good. Always for bad things. Wrenching, welding, all of the things associated with farming in a bad day. And he said, Trey, you need to look at this. I said, what's that? So we looked on the headland, the border around the field that was brown, and it was clearly too wet. The slot was open. There was mud on the closing wheels, and there was sidewall compaction where the discs had gone through the soil and feathered it out. He said, Trey, we can't plant this. He said, but look, where it turned green, it planted beautifully. That was our epiphany. That's what got us started planting green. What it was the soil was at equilibrium in terms of moisture. Where it was brown, it was too wet. So all of the things that we don't like about no-tilling, it's too wet in the spring. If it's cold and wet, you can't plant early. It makes you plant later. So a lot of times we would work ground just to dry it out, creating compaction zones so that we could get into the fields. It provides inconsistencies in the soil. We started getting the shovel out a lot more often. We took a shovel and you dig down, and where there's residue on top from the combines the year before, it's wetter and drier. Where the roots are from last year's crops and where they aren't is very inconsistent. So no-till is very difficult to get that even stand in your corn because while the field looks consistent on the top, it's very inconsistent on bottom. But we found that when we grew cover crops and we let them stay green, it would look more inconsistent on the top, but when you dug down into the soil, it was much more consistent, allowing us to get better stands, more even stands for the early growing conditions of the spring. So that's what it did. It was really, I was in my early 30s, and I thought I knew everything about farming. I'd been to university, I went to Purdue. George had been farming for 40 years. So we really knew what we thought was everything, and what that made us do was rethink the way we thought about farming. We've been very slow to adopt the system 100%. We're 100% green. We're 100% planting green now for all these reasons, but it's been a very slow adoption for us, and it's ended up with a lot more stuff that we've learned. So when the field's green, you have better water efficiency. The planting window in the spring becomes longer. You can get into fields 2 days earlier, and they don't dry out as quick if it gets really dry. We have less replant. The corn comes up better in a green environment, which shocked us. It was counterintuitive. It was counter to what we had always thought and what we had trained our minds to think. But all of this we've learned simply by doing it. It wasn't in any books. We have less change in soil temperature. If you get a cold spring, a lot of the reasons we would have replant was not that the soil was cold. It was the fluctuation in the temperatures from daytime to nighttime. That extreme fluctuation is what causes corn to corkscrew and go backwards, causing a lot of replant, a lot of rot. If you keep that field green and you have living roots there, the soil, the temperature variance gets subdued. It doesn't get as hot. It doesn't get as cold as cold at night, and it doesn't get as hot during the day. But because you're limiting that amount of fluctuation, we're able to plant earlier than we've ever planted. That really surprised us as well. Of course, erosion control in the face of climate change. We're getting bigger rains. The typical no-till environment is starting to get washes in it now. This spring, we're getting 12 and 14 centimeter rains in an hour or two. So the better we can guard that soil, the more we can hold it together, the better off we are. And then we believe we're getting higher yields, particularly as it pertains to soybeans, corn. Probably the yields are probably more on par, more even. So does everyone here know what I mean when I say plant green? Does anyone know that I don't? Show hands. So I'll show you a picture of a field that we would be planting in. This is a 5-way or 6-way mix. It's crimson clover. You can see a few white flowers out there. We've got rapeseed. We've probably got cereal rye in there. We usually mix a couple different cereals. And then we go out there with our planter, and voila. There's a planter planting a field that we would normally plant. So we plant every acre that we till this way. So some of it's this big when we start, and by the end of planting season, it's about this big. The more biomass, the better. Like I said, we're trying to find balances. We're trying to figure out which crops complement what crops. So we started out with just cereal rye. The problem is we got too much nitrogen tie up. The corn yields would take a hit because we had so much cereal rye out there, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that cereal rye was so high that it took all the nitrogen in the soil out, and then it took that much more back to feed the bacteria that were eating it, that we had to add legumes to it. So we're doing some pretty creative things there. Here's another picture. I think this is a video. Yeah. So this was just an average day of planting. This is planting soybeans. We'll typically use herbicides afterwards. We're experimenting with roller crimpers and trying to limit the amount of herbicides we use. We're getting away from insecticides, trying to find a better balance in the soil. I talked about temperature fluctuations. This is part of this is one of our planters has the new smart firmers, right? They measure the temperature of the soil in the trench, and this really shocked us this spring. Where we had cover crop, this is temperature, it's in Fahrenheit, which is unfortunate, but just to show, this field was split between cover crop and no cover crop, and there was a 12-degree differential between where we had the cover crops and didn't. Now, it was colder, so in the spring, that's probably not a good thing, but then I'm thinking, wait a second, if we get a really hot, dry summer, I want that soil cooler. I want it holding the moisture in. I want it shaded. I want it covered up. So we're learning through the technology. That's where the technology piece comes in. We're using every part of technology that we can utilize. Here's a satellite image of a field. This is one that's a test plot. This doesn't have cover crop where it's yellow. So the blue means that there's a lot of vegetation. You can see this is April 24th, which is early spring for us, about planting time. After we planted it, you can see here, June 23rd, you're starting to see, I can't point to it well enough, but you're starting to see a little streak there. And then now we're hot and dry, and you can still see that streak. The bottom part of the field where it's yellow is different soil types, so there's not much we can do there. But time after time, we're seeing that we're building resiliency in the soil by having it green, by having it armored. The crops are healthier coming up, particularly when it gets hot and dry, which is imperative for us in Maryland in the summer. And then what does that look like at harvest? So this was taken 2 years ago. This is what we like to see on our soil. This is corn obviously ready for harvest. This is in between the soil. That's last year's cover crop, still protecting the soil. You can see all the earthworm excrement laying around. They're taking all those nutrients, they're cycling it down. When we go out and do field checks, we're getting 20 to 30 earthworms per square foot. So we'll just take a shovelful, pull it out, and we're hoping to see 20 to 30 earthworms, different varieties of earthworms. Sometimes we get night crawlers, sometimes we don't. We're getting a lot of spiders. We're getting a lot of different critters that we never had, that we always would have sprayed for, but we're trying to get a better balance. So it all sounds really good, right? Everyone's ready to go plant green and do fields that look like mine, but there are some challenges. These are some of them. So there's a lot that we had to learn, and we're still learning. We learn every year. I try to have at least several failures a year just to keep me humble. But what we're doing now is crimping a lot of it. We learned that in corn, if you plant corn into something that's too tall and you shade the corn, it starts to compete for sunlight. It comes up and it gets spindly. So we built the roller crimper for that. Cereal's going to head. We had that problem. We did a lot of barley cereal because barley is the least expensive cereal that we can purchase at home. And the problem was we got a late planting on soybeans. The barley was headed out, and of course what happened when we went to harvest that barley, or harvest the soybeans, we harvested barley with the beans. We found some ways to alleviate that. One technique is to go out with 2,4-D, particularly if we're starting to get some glyphosate-resistant weeds in the field. That 2,4-D will regulate the growth of the barley and buy you about an extra 2 weeks. So I'm hoping that a lot of other farmers start farming like this so we can really start to come up with some creative solutions, whether it's using chemistry or not, and then hopefully using less chemistry. Early seedling, fertility, and slugs are probably our biggest problem. Do you guys have slugs here? Everybody know what a slug is? Yeah, they're horrible. They're nasty critters. We're thinking that pulling back our insecticide, we're making out much better, trying to get more of the beneficial bugs that can eat slugs. So that's an example of slug damage there. We have an entomologist from the University of Delaware working with us, Joanne, and she's really been doing a lot of work on them. So we're trying to figure out we're letting the cover crops grow with our crops at times, so that we're running them simultaneously till the corn gets to be a certain height, then spraying. We're doing things like we use atrazine on our corn. We're using atrazine, metallic chlor, and mesotrione in a blend, and we usually use paraquat with that. But we found if we use glyphosate instead of paraquat, it takes about 3 weeks to kill the cover crop. So what that does is it protects the corn that much longer. It gives the slugs a little more things to feed on until that corn crop gets big and can outgrow the slugs. Today, this is an example of us. This is the crimper that we built. So that's a normal case magnum. So you can see that the stuff's about 6 feet tall, about 8 tons per acre probably of biomass. And we're trying to get that. So you're probably, if you're a farmer, you're wondering what's it take to plant through all this stuff. So this is our typical planter setup. We have 1 blue planter, 1 green planter, and 2 red planters. It doesn't make sense, but that's the way we are. So I like row cleaners. Shoot. So up here, the row cleaners, if you don't have row cleaners that interlock, they tangle, we found that we can use interlocking row cleaners. And if you have a back plate on them, we use Martin ones. That's just the brand that we use. We don't have any trouble with tangles. The other thing that we learned very early in corn, the reason we got into cover crops to begin with was for the environment. In the Chesapeake Bay region, we get a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus runoff into the Chesapeake Bay, so there's a lot of environmentalists around us, so that's why we started cover cropping. Well, the problem is the reason that you cover cropped, or the reason we cover cropped based on environment, was that we were pulling all of the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the soil that was available to our corn crop. So while we were used to planting into an area that had mineralized nitrogen in it, we could bank on that through the soil. Now all of a sudden we were planting into an environment that was completely devoid of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we had to up our starter rates. So now we're putting starter on both sides. We've got these discs here. And we used to run 8 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of phosphorus, and 8 pounds of potash. Now we're running a 40-40-0 to get that nitrogen out there. The rest of the nitrogen is going on side dress and a variable rate application. And then closing wheels. The green plants a lot better, but it doesn't close as well. So what would normally be squished together, once you get those living roots in there, it cuts it. And it's very difficult to get it sewn back together. So you need some type of spike. You need something to kind of work that ground to get it back together. The roots are a great thing because as they break down, as they decompose, they break up the sidewall compaction, but they also are hard to get sewn back together. So we had a couple years where we struggled getting the trench closed. It would slot back together, but it wouldn't be welded together. So we've gone to the different spikes. If you look at this planter, we have a little different... we have a little different setup here. These we've tried. I like these. Now we're going to like a double spike system with a gauge wheel on it. But a lot of that's somewhat nuanced. But the starter is one thing that we've learned. This is a new row cleaner that we just tried this year by Martin as well. Not an advertisement from Martin, but it's got parallel linkage on the cleaners. So you can see that there's 2 links instead of 1 hinge point. And we're feeling that gives our unit a lot better ride. It's not jarring that unit all the time when it hits a stone. It's floating up and down like a planter unit would. They're interlocked, and then they have the plate, and we didn't stop them up at all this year. So we're planting days when it's raining, drizzling, because you're not getting any mud stuck to anything. There's nothing on your gauge wheels because it's going over top of green material. So a lot of things that we've learned along the way. So... what that's all led to is kind of a philosophy of soil health. Soil health is a fairly new term for me, but what we were doing is building this system and didn't know what we were doing. We hadn't heard of soil health. It hadn't been talked about, but the system works for us. We kind of came to it organically. George and I wanted to be able to plant sooner and plant earlier, but as we did this, we've learned that the soil became healthier. We're seeing the earthworms. We're seeing the beneficial insects. We're seeing organic matter increase. We're using less nitrogen and phosphorus. We're using less chemicals, which leads to better profitability, all the while getting healthier soils. So we've kind of come up with our own kind of a philosophy of it. The one I really like is never getting your hands dirty. If you handle healthy soils, you guys see it here with all the no-till, but if you get the roots growing all year long, you can go in after 1 or 2 or 3 to 6 centimeter rain and really pick that soil up, and it just kind of falls apart in your hands. So I'll kind of get into some of the other stuff. We're seeing a lot more diversity. Where we are, a lot of folks are blaming farmers for a decline in the bee population due to neonicotinoids, pyrethroids, and different insecticides. So we've limited those. We still treat our seed with neonicotinoids. But what we've done is try to get our cover crop mixture to where we have enough flowers that they start flowering early and they continue to flower until we plant. So rapeseed is our earliest one, canola. Then we have crimson clover mixed in, we have vetch mixed in. So we mix in all these things so our fields constantly have flowers, which that starts to translate into what I'm going to talk about next, which is some of the unique collaborations. When your fields have beautiful flowers, your neighbors love you. You've got pollen swirling, it smells good, but it's also bringing birds back. We have more songbirds, we have more bees, and the neighbors are starting to like me, which is a good thing. Why do we do it? We got Messi Jr. and Mia Hamm there, so that's why I do it. You know, as farmers, why do we farm? We do it because we do it for our children, for our families. That's why I do it. That's been a big part of the reason I've changed. Where I live, we have what are called river keepers. So these groups of people that come out to guard the river. And they're public groups, hundreds of people strong. Lots of the folks that I rent my land from join the river keepers. They donate money to them. These people patrol the river, they test the river, and they make sure that no one's doing anything wrong to that river. Very scary as a farmer when I work on 3 different rivers. Our rivers are smaller than yours. So I said, what can I do that's going to keep them from coming after me? And what we decided to do was to join them. So I'm on the board of our local river keeper, along with 1 other farmer and 10 environmentalists, a couple of scientists. But it gives us a voice. It gives us a conversation piece. And now that we're doing the cover crops, we're planting green, we're monitoring all these things on our fields, it gives us a good starting point to have that conversation, to collaborate. This is a picture of our river keeper, and that's my 2 kids out with the river keeper doing testing for the day. I took the picture. So I'm out there learning what's going on the river. How much of it is the farmer's fault, how much of it is not, and what is the farmer's fault, how do we help to rectify it? Can we change the way we farm? Is there a need to change the way we farm? Maybe there is. We've got tools we never had before. We've got technology. We've got all these things. So I'm trying to teach my kids that that's something they need to pay attention to, because that's the generation of landowners that I rent from now. Right? It won't be long. These folks will be owning land, and I've got to rent it from them to make a living. So here's some experiments they did. I won't go into the details because I'm getting tighter on time. But basically they facilitated grant money to have researchers come out from the University of Maryland and the United States Department of Agriculture to do studies on my fields. What are they studying? They're studying the resiliency of the soil. What's the difference in temperature fluctuation? How much more water holding capacity are we bringing? What's the difference in insect pressure? They're measuring it in real time. Stuff that I would not have the access to do, but because I've teamed up with the environmental community, we're getting real data off of real farms, which I think is real powerful. Some of the data sets that came off, this one I liked. It's not a very good graph, but I had Ray Weil come out. We did 5 replicated strips, 4 different strips of cover crops. So we had cover, early cover, late cover, no cover, and radish. And do you know what this graph is? This graph is the amount of nitrogen that was leaching into the groundwater on my home farm. Where we had covers was 4 times less. So pretty powerful. To me, that's where I live, that's where my home is, that's where my kids are, and a pretty easy solution. So it wasn't just a social thing, it wasn't just my kids, it was, wait a second, I purchased that nitrogen for money. I don't want to give it up. I want to give it back. So some of what we're doing with the environmental community is a nice complement to my finances. They don't want the nitrogen in the water any more than I do. Might be for 2 different reasons, but we certainly should be working together to figure it out. Let's get some fresh ideas in agriculture. Rather than me just talking to farmers all the time and learning from them, which I get a lot out of, it's nice to get someone that's way far away to come look at your farm. Ask you questions. Here's U.S. Department of Agriculture, Steve Mirsky. He's the one who taught me about carbon sequestration. I didn't know we were sequestering carbon by doing all this stuff. It was new to me, and he said, wait, Trey, you're really working on climate change. And I was like, what are you talking about? Doesn't make any sense. So he's pulling cords. He's testing for carbon in our soils. He's seeing how much organic matter we're gaining. He's seeing how old the nitrogen is that's 3 and 4 feet deep in the soil and what our differences as we change. As he looks at the soil profiles, he can tell how much nitrogen leached each year. So as we've adopted new practices, we use Corteva's variable rate nitrogen modeling. So we're doing in real time, we're putting on 70% of the nitrogen on our corn in real time in the summer based on weather data, soil data, and crop potential. That's all done that day. We send out the prescription to the sprayer. So all that plays into this. So it's a nice merger, nice collaboration of technology. So I'll kind of slide through these, working with her. This is just a picture of one of our experimental fields. So you can see the stark contrast. That's how we used to farm. That's how some folks still farm. That's what my father would have said. It's pretty. We did a lot of minimum tillage. And like I said, we just couldn't get the yields that we could. How to plant green. I'll skip that one. This is a bean field. Beans have been the most fun. Corn's not as fun because it doesn't always yield better. But this field, we had some early season grass come in on the brown side, and I didn't want it to go to seed. We grow a lot of wheat. So we didn't want that early season grass going to head, so we sprayed it off. We determined we wouldn't plant that half of the field green. No big deal. 3 or 4 years ago. It's since been replicated several times. So this side we let grow, and it ended up being cereal rye about this tall. It was horrible looking. We didn't roll it. We don't roll the bean ground. We just plant the beans and let them go. So you drive by, scouting as all good farmers do at a very high speed, looking at the rows. We see the no-till. We see the brown side. The beans come up. This side takes about a month before you can see the beans coming through the rye. Pretty scary stuff. So we go to harvest, and we couldn't harvest the rye side first because it was too damp. It was like cutting double crop beans. It was like cutting through straw. So we had to go to where the field was clean because it was easier to harvest. So we started out, and the operators called me, and they said, Trey, this place where it was killed off is doing great. Beans are running just over 5 tons per hectare. That's terrific. We got over to where the cereal rye was. They were running 6.1. It was a 1 ton per hectare difference between where we planted green versus where we planted brown. Less herbicide, less inputs, and a higher yield. Doesn't happen every time. I don't want anybody to go out and think that I'm right. I learn every year, but we've done this every year on several different fields. And with beans planted green, as long as they're planted early, are always yielding higher. I'm not sure why that is. I think beans like a little early stress, no different than the guys that are rolling their beans or putting a little cobra out early. I think that natural shading of the crop is what's giving them a little bit of stress. This was another field under a high-yield environment. It was corn, and we were concerned that we were getting a yield drag on corn. So all this did was, that's the sprayer track in blue. All it did was affirm that we didn't get a yield drag, which to me that was somewhat of a victory because we were still building soil health. We were building organic matter and all that. So some of the technology we're using, we use granular software. I recommend enterprise software to any farmer here. Makes life much easier, whether it's granular or one of their competitors. I'm not sure what's available here, but that's allowed us to put in a lot more complexity into our system. We're planting a whole nother crop now in the fall, and we're managing a whole nother crop in the spring as we plant our normal crop. So it really increases the complexity of the farm. The look of the farm, the feel of the farm, everything changes, but the management stays the same, right? The owners stay the same. So in order to deal with that complexity, we're using technology. In this case, it's granular. And smart farmers, I like this picture of the broken smart farmer. So with every technology that we all implement, it always costs us time. And figuring out how to allot for that time and what the value of that time is it, and then satellite imagery, I think it's going to be a game changer. Being able to monitor our fields every day that the sun shines and see the differences on our test plots and how they correlate to the yield map at the end of the season, I think is imperative, whether it's drones or satellites. I think that's really something that is great. And then moving forward, now that we're sequestering carbon, what my goal is to be carbon neutral as a farm. Didn't think I would have said, I hadn't even heard of that 4 years ago, but now I think it's pretty novel. I think that all farmers should try to shoot for that. So as we're sequestering carbon down, we should be able to get credit for that. We're helping to solve climate change, or we can help solve climate change. There's folks here that do it. I deal with a group in Seattle called Nori. They're establishing their own carbon market, and they're talking about making deals with people and getting me paid to farm like I'm farming, which I think is pretty good. But they're also taking all that data and making it transparent to the folks that are going to buy the carbon credits. So I've had to allow them to see everything on my farm. No financials, but in order to model carbon, I've opened my farm up, which is a very foreign feeling for me, particularly as an American farmer. But I think what that's going to do is as we start to do the carbon marketplace and we open our farms up and make them transparent and allow people to have the information about what we're doing, that gives us a terrific opportunity to share that with the consumer. We all struggle with relating to the consumer, particularly large ag, right? The guys that are the row crop farmers, everything else. But I think if we can take that and we have a record keeping of our corn and our soybeans, if we can put that through, in my case, chickens, and through to the grocery store, I might not have a premium product, but I've got a product that the public trusts. And I don't think it's that difficult to do. So I think that by having this carbon market and getting things like this rolling, where maybe it includes blockchain, maybe it includes these things that the younger folks talk about and know about that I don't know about, maybe we use those and we build trust in the next generation. They want data and they want a story and they want transparency in how their food's produced. So I think what we do is a great job as producers. We produce a really great product. The world is fed at a very inexpensive price because we have such a great agricultural community globally. But how do we translate that to consumers? Why do we feel like we're being beat down by the consumer? So rather than sit here and get beat down by the consumer, let's be proactive and provide exactly what they want. What company do we deal with where they say the consumer is wrong? They don't. Farmers, I don't think, should either. So I think that now that we have all this technology, we can start to get some of this stuff together. No matter what the size of the farm is, if we can start to get the records together, we can start to utilize the technology, we can build trust and faith in the folks that we're serving, which are the folks that buy the food that we've grown. And I think that we owe that to them. And I don't think it's that hard, and I think it can also be profitable. So I'll close. So I have a few minutes for questions. And I'll close with this. This was a teachable moment for me as a father. I took this picture of my kids. We had the opportunity to go to Germany, and this is the Berlin Wall. And I thought, wow, this is a great message for my children. Many small places, many small people who in many small places do many small things that can alter the face of the world. I talked to a lot of environmentalists, and all they want to do is alter the face of the world for the better. That's their goal in life as an environmentalist. And they're all very jealous of the power I have to change the environment as a farmer. So I think that every farmer here has this great opportunity to alter the face of the world, whether it's climate change, consumerism, growing a great product that we're proud of. This is what hangs in my office that actually ended up being a teachable moment for myself. So and I'll close with that. If there's any questions, I'm open to them.
Bueno, Trey, muchísimas gracias una vez más.
Thank you very much again, Trey. We're happy with your presentation, and I have a question. At one point, you talked about the fact that you wanted to reduce herbicides, but you also talked about insecticides. In Argentina, at Rosario National University, there is a group of researchers who are trying to work on a new concept, which is ecological pest management. They leave some corridors with flowers, the goal being to develop benefic populations that eventually attack our pests, and this way the use of pesticides might be reduced. In your case, have you seen any changes in the reduced use of pesticides thanks to the inclusion of flowers, as we saw on the screen, and through the green planting processes?
Yes. We're not using any broadcast insecticides at all. This year we had to do 3 fields that got grasshoppers. I don't know if you guys get grasshoppers, but we're starting to get a much better balance in the soil. We're not seeing the cutworms. We're not seeing the army worms. And I think the flowers are bringing. We had one great example. We had a lot of rapeseed in one field with our soybeans. and the rapeseed didn't die when we crimped it, and it didn't die from the spray. So we were getting a lot of cabbage moths in it. Cabbage moths don't eat the beans. So the moths were all over the field. They were bringing in the insects that feed on them. So now our field is armored with all these beneficial insects that if something attacks our beans, we'll go into it. It wasn't something, normally if we see a lot of moths flying, we would have sprayed a pyrethroid. In this case, we're scouting a lot more, but we're definitely using less insecticide, and I think we are hitting a better balance. It doesn't always hold true, but I would agree with that, and I think the flowers are a big part of it. I think the birds are a big part of it, so we're seeing a lot more songbirds. We're seeing a lot more birds in our fields. You can see it when you're scouting. If we scout a field that's been sprayed off, you don't see many birds. If you scout a field that is flowering with cover crops, you have birds, you have bees, you have insects, and we think that that's helping a lot.
Perfecto. Te transmito una pregunta del público.
I have a question from the audience. What mix of service crop do you use?
We use we're trying to get more and more crops in it. More, I think that the more diversity of crops you have, the healthier the soil becomes, the more the roots begin to talk, and the better that complements our crops. So what we do is we always have a cereal, we always have a legume, and we always have a mustard. Now we're trying to get to where we're doing 2 or 3 of each of those. So our base mix is the 3. We find that really easy to plant through. Cereal with crimson clover and rape, we know works. We know it's easy to plant. We're doing a decent amount of vetch now. Vetch still kind of scares me because it's a vine. But it has a nice late flower. And then we're getting into some of the, we use some radish, and we're using some oats, some lupines, some sunflowers. Whatever I can get my hands on economically, we throw in the mix, and we're getting a lot more comfortable with having a lot more plants out there.
Are you thinking of integrating cattle as well? Do you have any winter crop for harvest?
I would love to. I don't have any cattle experience, and I probably am not a cattleman, but I have started talking to some of my neighbors that have cows. We're not in a cattle area. We're in a more metropolitan area, so we don't have the broad expanses that you folks have. But I have talked to some of the guys that are doing consumer end, guys that are taking to the farmers market, some smaller cattle growers that I'm going to start to let them graze my cover crops to feed their animals, but also help with the biology of the soil. We use a lot of chicken litter as a substitute, and then we use a decent amount of compost since we're not getting it naturally through the ruminants.
And when you think of soybean crop, what other service crops do you use to plant green with soybean for cover crops?
We do the same thing with the soybeans. They like cereal rye. They like the cereals. The cereals, you have to find crops that are unlike the crop that you're planting. If you look at the natural ecology of, say, a prairie, the grasses compete with grasses, but the underneath things aren't competing. They're usually complementing those grasses. So we're trying to figure out what those are. I think in the case of soybeans like cereals. They're a really nice complement. This year we took a field and we planted it really early spring, April 2nd, as early as we've ever planted, but we waited until May 7th to spray it. So we had this nice mix of cover crops, which was primarily a cereal, with the beans growing through it. Then we hit it with a shot of glyphosate, and we were done, because there were no competing weeds. There was no mare's tail. There was no pigweed. There was no anything, because the cover crops, the service crops, had kept them out. So that got us down to about a $3 application, as opposed to our normal spray, which is probably about 27. Or, sorry, it would be $7.50 a hectare, and normally about $70 per hectare.
There's another question about economic aspects. Do you get an economic compensation when you do carbon sequestration and when you use reduced volumes of insecticides?
I do not get any subsidy for that. There's a lot of folks that are trying to tie some of our normal government subsidies to conservation practices, but at the moment we don't. I think in one state, maybe Illinois, they gave a $10 credit on their crop insurance if they cover cropped. but we don't get anything yet for carbon. I think the market still needs to be built, but I think it takes a wave of farmers that will have some supply chain ready. So that's kind of what I'm working on. I do it regardless, but if I can, if there's a new market opening up, I think it's a great opportunity for me, hopefully to make more money, given the global cost of, or global profitability of farming.
What herbicides did you stop using in green planting?
Well, we stopped all our pyrethroid use. That's the insecticide that we normally would use that kills most bugs. On our corn, we've dropped our atrazine rates in half, and we've dropped our metallochlor rates in half, which also, we buy a 3-product thing called Lexar. It's a Syngenta product, which also has mesotrione for atrazine and glyphosate-resistant weeds. So we just keep dropping that rate back. We tried a couple fields in the absence of all herbicides this year. The cornfield did not work well because of the way my planter's set up. It didn't work. The crimping didn't work, so we ended up spraying it with glyphosate alone as opposed to the whole package, and the glyphosate took care of it and the field's clean. The soybean field has a lot of foxtail in it, or grass. It's not a lot, but it's we haven't sprayed it yet, but I think that I'm just starting down that road of having the fortitude to start pulling my herbicides back, and particularly now that we have different GMOs where we can fix problems. In beans, it's very difficult because if you have mare's tail or pigweed grow while the beans are growing, there's no way to kill them. So I was always reluctant to pull out my residuals. Now we have the dicamba option, so while I'm not spraying any dicamba, I'm buying some dicamba beans in an effort to be able to fix any messes that I might make by pulling back on my herbicide rates.
Well, thank you very much, Trey. I'd like to summarize some points I've taken down while you spoke, which I think are main messages. I think our society, we usually talk, I know you don't like us talking about sustainability, but that's a term we use quite a lot. And I try to use it to join the 3 pillars. In sustainability, we talk about social sustainability, and it's difficult for me to understand social sustainability when I see production systems, and I'm keeping some of your words. Partnership and participation as a challenge, not complaining, interacting, having others measure what I'm doing and having my work controlled so as to make sure that I'm doing things the right way. I'm also keeping your message about the environment. I think your presentation has covered that aspect, and I think there is a strong commitment to reduce the use of insecticides, pesticides. I know you're concerned about carbon sequestration and the Chesapeake Bay. And finally, and there were also questions about this, you talked about the economic aspects. I usually feel that in sustainability, the economic part plays a huge role while the environmental and social aspects are left behind. But you have left the economic part for the end. So I think those 3 pillars related to sustainability are important. You said that you're doing well, so undoubtedly you are also meeting the needs of that 3rd pillar. And there is a word I'd like to point out, opportunity. I think in Argentina we have a huge opportunity to start linking those 3 pillars and start, I'm not sure whether we can start planting green. I think it's a huge and interesting challenge, but at least we can start capturing carbon so as to mitigate climate change. Thank you very much for your presentation, Trey.